So good morning. I think we can start this very special session. I want to thank you all to be here, those who are in presence and all those who are online. We have a few very close and old friends online as well, and I thank them for being here with us, even if online. This is a very special occasion dedicated to Bruno Contini. First of all, I give the floor to Elisabetta Ottozzi, head of the Department of Economics and Statistics, Cognetti de Martis, where Bruno served for a few years.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm very pleased and honored to meet here, to be here to introduce. Sorry, I'm a little bit to celebrate Bruno Contini, who has been a leading figure in economics in Italy, and of course in the University of Turin. And as Leah had just said, he was back from the States in '71, and he was a professor. He took one of the first chairs of econometrics at the University of Turin. It was then the Faculty of Political Sciences, which had a department of economics, Cognetti de Martis, which is now, after 2012, became one of the two departments of the University of Turin. Bruno spent many years in the States. He got his PhD from the Carnegie Institute of Technology in 1966. And there was, he was inspired by a very lively academic and intellectual environment. In particular, there were many developments at that time in modern econometrics, so that when Bruno came back to Italy, he brought with him many new tools. But what is really important for him is that he didn't only use these new tools and opened a new path of research, but really brought a new vision of economics, one granted in one rooted in observation, and a vision of economics which could suggest research questions, the construction of data, and so an approach which was not so common in academic in Italy at that time. He had, well, let me just allow me a sort of personal memory. In the 70s, I was in high school. So I was very far away, but I had a brother who was one of the first who take her dissertation, her degree with Bruno. And so I heard about Bruno, even if I was outside, and I heard about that professor who had just come back from the States, who was very lively, very warm, and he could in fact have a whole group of people who followed him. So when I attended political science myself, I was confronted with Bruno, and I have very good memories. I remember his textbook, Introduzione all'Econometria, was one of the first approach into econometrics. So the role of Bruno was very, very important because he fostered the role of econometrics in Italy. His chair was not the first, but I think the second chair of econometrics in Italy. And so he had an incredible role in fostering the University of Turin and Turin in empirical research and econometrics. He applied, he was very soon interested in labor economics, and at that time it was particularly innovative, the use of longitudinal and administrative microdata, which were sources that at the time were not so much used in Italy. So it really opened a field of research, and this allowed an approach to labor economics, which was not only static, but a dynamic approach, which could allow to see what was inside it. So all the adjustments, all the mobility, entry, exit, so to give all a real picture of what was the labor market. The other things to say, a point what is very important, is that Bruno's research was always very linked and very interested to policy-related topics. So that social and economic problems were always at the heart of his research. I don't know if it is the right term in English, an engaged economist. It's a translation of what is in French, engagé, very attentive to political, social, and economic problems. So this is a really important aspect I want to make. And so what am I say? That Bruno gave a great change to academia in Italy, and of course to University of Turin in particular. And he was a great mentor. There are generations of people, I think you might be as well here, who inherited, who benefited from from the research environment he could create, which was a very rigorous, very open. And so what to say? Thank you, Bruno, and I'm very glad that you are here.
Let me add a few words. I'm very happy because this is a moment of celebration, and we are celebrating a person to whom we owe a great deal and who means so much to us. And we are doing so together with an outstanding scientist who has honored us for many years with his closeness. Let me begin with David Card. What can one say to greet the presence of the winner of the 2021 Nobel Prize in Economics? One say about his enormous contribution to our ability to understand reality by going beyond established theories and challenging consolidated knowledge through a rigorous methodology that pushes the frontier of both theoretical reflection and empirical methods. Let me mention only the topics for which we are most indebted to David Card: wages, migration, education. Those are the key issues of our time if we want to reflect on solid theoretical and empirical foundations on how to defend and strengthen social cohesion in our societies. I also like to recall that David began visiting Turin exactly 25 years ago. And since then, the dialogue has never been interrupted through his visit to Turin and the periods of study that many of us spent in Berkeley. So thank you, David, for being here with us on this very special occasion. And it is special because we are celebrating Bruno Contini, who is reaching an important milestone that deserves to be properly celebrated. Bruno has given so much to the profession and has given so much to the people who had the good fortune to study and work with him. Let me recall his visionary ability to understand the importance of using administrative data as a tool to capture otherwise invisible phenomena concerning firms' employment and wages, phenomena that must be observed under a microscope, just to quote the title of his book with Riccardo Revelli. A tool to show reality different from the mainstream narrative on the labor market, a narrative that failed to see what happened beyond medium-large firms. And we are talking about the 80s, when the use of administrative data was far from being not only fashionable, but even shared or simply understood. But Bruno did not teach us only this. He showed us the intellectual rigor of not seeking shortcuts or simplifications when investigating complex phenomena. He taught us not to focus on small questions or marginal increments to consolidated knowledge, but to study important topics which require long-term work, collaborations, and repeated attempts to understand them. And he showed us the power of intellectual curiosity, of empathy with the people who live the realities we study through cold numbers. And he gave us warmth, patience, and respect as he taught us this profession. Bruno, generation of economists owe you a profound debt of gratitude, both intellectual and personal. And let me conclude in Italian saying, tanti auguri Bruno, e grazie, e ti vogliamo bene. And now, David, the floor is yours.
It's great to be here. Bruno just turned 90. Believe it or not, our birthdays are only about a week away. I just turned 70. This is the 25th year that I've been in Turin. So this is a great opportunity for me to offer some thanks to Bruno and for first inviting me and to getting me involved with visiting Italy and Italian economics and so on. First of all, I wanted to start with a classic. I'll explain where this comes from in a minute, but I thought we should probably get some posters made. Bruno is uno. So Bruno was born in 1936 in Ferrara. He knows who this is. In 1941, his family was interred in Pizzaferrato in the Apennine Mountains, just east of Rome. If you've ever driven through there, it's incredibly rough and beautiful. And it turned out, he was, of course, only 5 years old. He was one of the two Brunos in that town, and he's told us a couple of times some good stories of the two Brunos. This is the other Bruno. This is Bruno Sammartino. Now, probably most Italians of your age here don't know who Bruno Sammartino is. He was the leading professional wrestler in the United States for more than 20 years. He sold out Madison Square Gardens 147 times, which is still by far the record. Interestingly enough, he actually preceded Bruno to Pittsburgh. So Bruno's been following the other Bruno around forever. Anyway, so after the war, Bruno moved with his mother to Milan. He spent a year in San Francisco, so his connections to the West Coast. He graduated from high school in San Francisco called Washington High, which is still there in the Richmond district, and you can see the view of Golden Gate Bridge from Washington High. Maybe that's inspired him over the years. He went to Bocconi, that other Italian university that has some economics. I'm getting some of this information from this very interesting interview he did with Orly Ashenfelter, which if you haven't listened to it, I recommend it, and the transcript's available if you want to get all the details. Apparently he was not a great student at Bocconi, but he wrote a thesis on the Italian coal industry, which somehow found its way to Franco Modiani, who, as everyone knows, was probably the single most important Italian-American economist and helped to get a lot of Italian kids to go to the United States at that time. So Bruno ended up following Franco to Carnegie Tech, which is now called Carnegie Mellon University. He did his PhD studies between 1960 and 1966, with, as far as I can tell, a little bit of time off at Olivetti, up in the mountains. He overlapped, as was mentioned, with some really interesting scholars, probably the single most interesting group of people assembled at that time in economics. So it included Oliver Williamson, Dale Mortensen, Bob Lucas, Leonard Rapping, and he started as a research assistant for a character who most people probably have never heard of, unless you sort of dug into the deep history of rational expectations, named Jack Muth. There's two Muths. Jack Muth was the one who wrote the most important paper, probably, but didn't do much after that. And the key thing about that paper was Bruno was the research assistant on the empirical part of it, which showed, or first adopted or showed how you could construct a demand and supply system where the supply function depended on future expectations of prices, and the price function was actually the rational expectation for that market. Okay, so they're basically solving for a functional equilibrium, which was incredibly innovative and had a huge impact on Lucas's eventual understanding of how, how we would model the macroeconomy. Anyway, we're going to cut. I'm going to cut it down a little bit from now. So, 66 to 70, he was in Berkeley. Believe it or not, he had 2 papers from his thesis the same year. 1968 was a great year for Bruno. He had a paper in the AER and a paper in Econometrica. I have read both of them in prep for this. The one that I think is really interesting, this is the one in the AER. And interestingly, that was the one that Orly first read. So Orly Eschenfelder was my thesis advisor. He's sort of in between Bruno and I in age, and his PhD is from just a little bit before this time. This is a paper about a bargaining experiment that was actually conducted in a lab. Now, what Orly pointed out is, to the best of his knowledge, and Orly is the kind of person who has this kind of detailed, nerdy knowledge, this is the first paper with a lab experiment published in the AER. So this was incredibly innovative. And it's really interesting to go back and look at it, because it basically lays out a couple of hypotheses about how the value of time, the cost of time in negotiating, affects the outcome. And one of them is very similar to the insight that Rubinstein eventually had about the parties having different values of time. But the other one I've never seen anybody test, which looks at if both parties are under a lot of time pressure, so the cost of delay is higher and higher, they're more likely to reach an agreement which is not Pareto optimal. Kind of interesting insight. I think probably there's a thesis there. Anyway, 1971, Bruno was back to Italy, to the University of Turin, where he had this long career. Initially, he worked on natural resources, in fact, floodplain problems in this area. But somehow or other found his way to labor economics, thank heavens, got out of that natural resource stuff. And I'm not exactly sure how this all happened, but at some point, Bruno became convinced about the value of using administrative data and trying to squeeze some data out of IMPs. That could be used, because everyone knew that they had this incredible data set, and actually the same kinds of data that existed in other countries. And my understanding is the creation of the WIP data set was probably the first one that was readily publicly available, although some had been kind of floating around in the U.S. And had been used to some extent. Okay. So then my connection, we all, what are we going to here? So February 13th, 2001, so literally 25 years ago, I get this email from Bruno saying that I've been invited to a child workshop, and they wondered if I could possibly stay and go to the laboratorio out in Mount Cagliari at that time. And I remember meeting, I think I met Leah the first time there. I don't know who else was there at the time, but anyway, it was very interesting. Everybody was working on temporary contracts, and there was a law about below Naples someplace you could get an exemption for the tax if you hired more workers, and they were using this data to try and get it. It was very exciting and interesting. Now, so that was the start of my connections to Italy, and I just want to talk about one feature of visiting Italy that has turned out to be incredibly costly. So during that first trip, my wife and I, Cindy, who's here, I asked Bruno where we should go, in the touring. He said, well, maybe you want to go down to Alba and Barbaresco and Barolo and Verduno. And he actually told us about a beautiful place in Verduno, which we've stayed in a number of times over the years. And of course, once you get down there and start drinking the wine, this is going to be a very costly thing. And I've calculated, this is the bill, Bruno. I'm presenting you the bill. So this is 25 years. Let's say a bottle a week of good, Barbaresco, Barolo. And of course, being an economist, I'm not going to charge you for the bottle. I'm going to charge you the opportunity cost. So let's say on average I'm paying 100, which is pretty cheap for any of these wines these days. Back then, you could have maybe gotten a Gaia for 100. And my usual California junk, let's say that's 20 in current dollars. So that's exactly 100K. So I'll be collecting the check later. Anyway, So there is, on the other hand, there was a huge amount of benefit. I don't want to, it's not all costs. And of course, the big benefit is getting to know so much about Italian labor market. Written paper with Francesco and Agata looking at features in the Italian labor market. And then Francesco and Maria Cristina and Andrea Weber and I have a recent paper going back to IMSS data. So and that was kind of one of the first papers I wrote using European administrative data, which I've been doing over the years since then. So the chance to meet many of the people in this room over the years and do all of that has been helpful. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, what I want to do is sort of talk about the value of administrative data. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and try and get slightly more serious. So I'm going to talk about using admin data for policy relevant research, a little bit of a history of this, but it's a very personal history, so I'm going to tell you about how I kind of came to do it, what my route through that. I'm going to start with training programs. I'm going to talk about displaced workers, unemployment insurance programs, minimum wages, and then gender differences. And I'm going to omit many hundreds of other great topics. I'll mention some of those at the end, including analysis of temporary contracts and so on. My introduction to administrative data for policy relevant research come about because of evaluation of training programs. So in the early 1960s, the Kennedy administration created a series of programs called the Manpower, they used to call it Manpower Development Training Act. And they spent a fair amount of money on this. The programs were fairly controversial. Republicans didn't like them and Democrats liked them. In 1970s, Orley, my advisor, was working in the Department of Labor under the Nixon administration, believe it or not, which even back then the Republicans had research, and got interested in evaluating MDTA. And and this is actually a very interesting document. If you're an economic historian or in history of economic thinking, this is the 1963 economic report on manpower report to the president. Now, the thing you really need to know about this document is the guy who wrote it was Bob Solow. Okay, so this is the smartest person in economics probably at that time, probably for all time, and a great writer. And it's really got 1,000 ideas in it. So if you need to get inspired about something you could think about, and they were focusing very much on technological adaptation and unemployment because they were concerned about how automation and robots were going to take all the jobs in 1963. Okay, so just in case you're thinking that this AI thing is going someplace. Anyway, it's great to read it because it's just, first of all, it's really beautifully written, and secondly, it's got a lot of ideas. Anyway, so Aschenfelder eventually wrote a paper, and he used administrative data, Social Security records, exactly the same kind of data as you get from IMSS. And in his paper, he identified 3 key reasons why you needed administrative data, and these are really the reasons I think. I've never seen a document where Bruno basically said this, but I'm pretty sure these are the basic ideas that he had. First of all, you need large sample sizes if you're going to track and detect the kind of effects that labor economists look for. I mean, we all know that the kind of programs that we're studying have 1 or 2, or a big program is 10% increase in something, a bit or at most, and a lot of useful programs might only be 5%. To detect something like that, you're going to need a large sample. You're going to need to be able to track people over time, the dynamic aspect of it. So for instance, the training programs, you go into training maybe for a year, you're not really going to see the benefit of that for several years, and you're going to need to have a data set where you can actually be sure you're not losing people, especially the people of interest or the comparison group. So that's crucial, this longitudinal element. And the third thing is you're going to have to think of how to have a comparison group. Now, you can see what Orley said, an adequate experimental design. Now, to write that you need an adequate, this paper's in 1978, that you need an adequate experimental design in economics in 1978 was just unbelievable. Like, no one talked about that since the Coles Commission in the 40s. No one had really talked about that idea. And I'm going to give some examples of how longitudinal data has been used after that. Now, here's a key picture of Orley's data. And his paper is great, but it doesn't have any graphs. And if you're going to teach the paper, you want to do this graph. So it shows the comparison group earnings and the trainees, and these trainees all were in a program in 1964, okay? And you can see something that everybody now knows about, which is people who go into training programs and probably had a year or two before that where they weren't doing very well. And Jim Heckman identified this as the Ashenfelter dip. You might have thought that was a dance from the 1950s, but it's actually this pre-programmed drop. And what that means is you're going to have problems with the parallel trends assumption that we all understand. Now we all understand you need. Okay. Now, when Orley wrote his paper, he proposed what amounted to a difference of differences design, but he didn't use that word. Okay. So that word comes a little bit later. But he was looking at this and saying, well, you know, if I change when I take my difference, if I take it here and stop there, I'm going to get like one effect. If I take it back here and go up to here, which you probably would do now, you'd see these programs look like they were pretty effective, by the way. Okay, so these are his findings. There was the administrative data was extremely useful. There's this dip. You need to use some kind of a comparison group. You probably need 2 or 3 years post-program. And this incredibly valuable to have lots of periods before and after, okay, to really understand what's going on. Now, a few years after that, I was a grad student. I entered the PhD program in 1978, the year this paper came out. Orley became my advisor, and I was finishing my grad school, and there's a group of consultants that were trying to evaluate the next generation of training programs. And they came to Orley basically because their evaluations were all not working. Okay, they were like giving incredibly bad results. And so Orley and I got eventually involved, and we wrote a paper in 1985. And the most important thing about this paper is I remember working on it. At that time, my office was in the library at Princeton, and it closed at midnight. So if you had a late night deadline and you wanted to kind of continue working in your office, which everyone had to do back then because there was no computers, no internet. You had to work on the computer at the office. You're in overnight. Okay, so Orley and I are in there. It's about 3 in the morning. He's working away on the document, and I'm trying to get the tables together. And he used to smoke big cigars. So he comes out. He's got a cigar going. The place is just reeking, and he says, "Okay, I've got it. This is it. This is great." And if you know Orley, you'd know that this is how he'd talk. He invented the term difference of differences. So I was literally there the day. Now, it's possible that somebody had invented it before. I've looked many times, and I believe that was the day. Okay, so anyway, here's the data that we had. And you can see why the people called us in, because there's a comparison group. Here's the trainees, and if you look at that, they're not really doing very well. And there's a pretty serious dip here, even a bigger Ashenfelter dip. And so we had the idea, and at that time, and Bruno will tell you this if you ask him, at that time, the way that you would do these kind of things is you try and develop a model of the dynamic process. And so we developed a model with a fixed effect, a random trend, and a first-order autoregressive error. And we showed that that would give rise to, this is the simulated pattern from that kind of model after estimating it in the data. And you can see it kind of fits, but there was a serious problem, which is we were trying to decide, is the selection based on entering, this is people who trained in 1976, okay? So is the selection based on 1975 earnings or 1976? It turned out that mattered quite a bit. So we got kind of depressed about that. So now let's jump ahead. Orley and I had many great PhD students in the 80s. One of them you may have heard of is Robert Lalonde, who wrote a great thesis on the need for experiments to try and sort out what's going on with longitudinal data. And in the 1990s, in the 1980s, we had this really serious recession. It was considered it used to be called the Great Recession until we got the really Great Recession in 2006. And the Department of Labor introduced this survey called the Displaced Workers Survey. And they asked people about jobs they had before and how many people lost jobs. And so that was understood. But they didn't have a way to get a comparison group. And so no one really knew if the job losses were really serious or whether they were small. And 1991 or so, I remember Bob Lalonde came back to Princeton to present this research that he was doing with another PhD student, Dan Sullivan, who I had written a paper on training programs with, and a third guy, Lou Jacobson. And I remember we had seen a lot of bad papers that semester. You know, if you're sitting in a labor economics seminar and there's like bad paper, bad paper, bad paper. And then finally somebody came in with a paper and said, geez, that's the best paper we've seen all year. And it was this paper. It's the famous Jacobson-Lalonde-Sullivan paper using administrative data, and what they had this brilliant idea to do is to get a comparison group for people who lost a job in a displacement, look at the previous coworkers, okay? So this is a comparison. These are the dudes who got laid off. That's their coworkers who didn't get laid off from the same mass layoff event, okay? And you can see they track really well before, and you get a pretty compelling design. And subsequently, economists have used this coworker design for all kinds of problems. Recently, I've been using it with Andrea Weber and Rudy Finter-Ebner and a few others to look at people who emigrate from Austria to Germany. So we get the previous coworkers. So this idea is just an incredibly great idea. Later on, Dan Sullivan and another PhD student of mine, Till von Wachter, merged the UI records that created the displacement with health records to look at the costs in terms of death of being displaced. And this is the estimated impacts and percentage points of on death of the people who are laid off relative to their comparison coworkers. And this shows another idea about administrative data that's really important, which is you can have two administrative data sets and you can merge them. And then you can create like an incredible resource that people haven't really thought of. And many of the papers we've been seeing over the last couple of days have versions of that idea. So that's an incredibly useful idea. I want to then talk about unemployment insurance. Unemployment benefits are incredibly important, controversial again. Democrats like them, Republicans hate them. And there's always been a long discussion about the disincentive effects and how you could get people to go back to work rather than sit at home and burn off their benefits. And so this is a paper, I remember this paper pretty well. It's by Woodbury and Spiegelman. Probably you haven't seen it in the AER. Orley was the editor at the time of the AER. In fact, he was the editor for about 10 years. And whenever he had a paper that he thought was really important and he didn't really think that other referees would understand what was going on, I had to referee it. So this is one of the many papers that I refereed that finally made it into the AER. And this was an example of a randomized control trial implemented with administrative data. And that's another thing that is really key about about admin data, is if you have the admin data and you can talk your way into it, you can use that as the framework for incredibly useful experiments. And so this experiment was give people who are starting a claim of unemployment benefits a deadline. Say, if you actually get a job within 11 weeks of starting your benefits, we'll give you cash. Okay, relatively small. It was only $500 if they did that. And this shows the effect. So there's a control group and a treatment group because it's an RCT. Both of these people are starting unemployment spell. The fraction who ended UI within 11 weeks, 41% for the treatment group, 35% for the control group, so there's a positive treatment effect on that. You're reducing that. Qualified for the bonus was smaller than that. Weeks of UI claimed was reduced. UI benefit costs were reduced. The bonus cost $68 per claimant, okay, because lots of people didn't qualify, and then even among the people who qualified, people don't get their checks, as everybody kind of knows. So it turned out this was a net winner for the government. It also was not harmful for the workers, so they didn't take lower wage jobs. So this is a kind of a nice paper that shows an RCT with admin data. Another example of using UI records to look at UI programs, this is a well-known paper by Schmeider, von Wachter, and Bender that looks at the age discontinuities, so there's jumps and how long you're eligible for unemployment benefit by age in Germany. And as you jump from age 44 to 45, from 46 to 47, there's increases in the duration of benefits. So the benefit is 12 months if you're under 45. It goes to 18 months if you're between 45 and 47. And then it goes to 22 months if you're after age 47. Now, who knows why they do this? But that's the great thing. Like if we like when the program designers do something completely crazy, because then we've got a research design. Okay, and this is an example of the regression discontinuity design, which didn't exist in the 70s and 80s, but where it really got going, or not, it wasn't on the minds of economists at least, but has really become one of the crucial pieces of the toolkit in this area now. And you can see this is the non-employment rates, and so we raised the duration of benefits by 6 months, and the amount of time that people spend out of work rises by about 3/4 of a month. So a small effect relative to the increase in benefits, but at least an important thing to keep in mind. minimum wages. Now, these other topics are controversial, but minimum wages takes it to a whole new level. Like that's that's the thing that everybody gets pissed off. And it's already mentioned this morning, there was a paper on the minimum wage in Germany, but there's a couple of really interesting features about this minimum wage thing that had kind of always struck me personally. First of all, at the time, the head of Angela Merkel's Economic Council was one of my former PhD students, Christoph Schmidt. And Christoph, like many German economists, is pretty conservative. And so of course, I had already written all this work saying minimum wages didn't have big employment effect, but Christoph was convinced this was the worst possible idea and that 1 million jobs were going to be destroyed. So that's one thing. The second thing is, for some reason, the Germans decided to have an hourly minimum wage in a country where no one's paid by the hour. So actually no one even knows what their hours are. And it's not legally there's this flexibility on the hours. My guess is this was a way to give the employers flexibility. So you could say, okay, you've got to pay $8.50 an hour. And like everybody's looking at themselves like, well, how many hours do I work? I don't even remember, right? Because everyone gets a monthly contract in Germany, as they do in Italy and most of the civilized world. Anyway, this is the design that Dussmann et al., and I think, in all honesty, a lot of the credit for this paper goes to Attila Lindner, who's one of the Berkeley PhD students who's really done a lot of interesting, innovative work on minimum wages. And the key thing about having Attila there was he also because Christian Dussmann was also kind of opposed to minimum wages, and so they ultimately wrote a paper which found that minimum wages weren't so bad. So this is how they did it. Because they don't really have very good data on hourly wages, and there's a lot of transitory components of wages, like we saw with training programs, they look at the 2-year hourly wage growth for people, stratified by the bucket that they had of their initial wage. And this is a bit noisy, okay? That's the minimum wage right there. And so the 2-year average wage increase, and so this is the 2-year average wage increase from 2011 to 2013. There's no minimum wage. Low guys are going up because there's growth of wages and a little bit higher for young people. They're younger people and so on. 214 is kind of similar to 213. And then 215, the minimum wage is here and 216. And so those are above the line. So this excess growth here, you can attribute to the minimum wage. Okay? And so they calculate out what that is. And now what they want to do is say, okay, so what's the net? This is the net gain. So you can see this is the difference of differences. So this is the 2-year wage change relative to the 2-year wage change 211 to 213. Okay, so this is the difference of differences by bins. You can see how that works. And the part of the paper that, of course, I was waiting to see and very interested in was what happened to employment. And it looks like this. So pretty much flat line. If anything, slight positive at the bottom. And this is unconditional on what firm you work for, anything like that. They make a big deal in the paper about possibly there was some job loss at small firms and people went to big firms. But the main thing in terms of the net effect of the law is this. Okay, the last topic I'll talk about is gender gaps in wages. This is a topic that's near and dear to the hearts of many labor economists. How am I doing for time? Okay, good. Okay. I can talk a little bit faster, but I'm pretty sure no one will understand. The kind of conventional economic theory that we all insist on teaching our undergraduates, even though they have no idea why we're doing this, is something that Gary Becker wrote in his undergraduate thesis in Princeton in the 1950s. And it's all about how there's a set of firms that hire black workers and there's a set of firms that don't. And of course, in 1950, that's how the labor market worked. In 1950, there were firms that were basically all black and there were firms that were basically all white, but there were no integrated firms in southern United States. There were a few in the north, but these days, that's not how it works. And the law, as it evolved, covering discrimination, really has two things. It says, one, that a given firm can't pay women less than men, or black people less than white people, for the same work. And secondly, they should be fair in their hiring. So they should be equally likely to hire a female candidate and a male candidate if there's a slot available or whatever. And how do you actually study that? Well, you need administrative data because you're going to try and look at detailed firm behavior And this is a feature that you couldn't do with the original WIP panels because they had a sample of workers that were a little thin when it came to individual employers. And now with the 100% samples that are available at AMPS and in the German system and US system and so on, it's possible to do that. You can basically identify the behavior of firms, and it turns out, this famous paper, we've already seen discussion about this, Aboud, Kamar's, and Margolis paper, introduced a two-way fixed effect model which identifies a component of wages which is associated with the individual, no matter where they work, and another component which is specific to their current employer. I always call those wage premiums. And of course, the neoclassical theory is there are no wage premiums except compensating differentials. That's okay. So if you're really a hard line, you can say these are all compensating differentials, or you could say that it's something to do with wage setting behavior. Rafa's paper yesterday suggesting that, in fact, for instance, if your employer is really like a family company, that's going to be a significant reduction in the size of these premiums. Anyway, with that framework, you can identify the two things that the law talks about, because you can identify the relative probability that women get hired at the higher wage firms. Okay? And that's why it makes sense to police discrimination in that dimension, because there are high-wage firms and low-wage firms, and we don't want the women not getting the jobs at the high-wage firms. Okay? If you don't have this AKM-type framework, it doesn't really make any sense. If all wages are the same everywhere, who cares what job you get hired at? Okay? So the law was kind of ahead of the economists on that. And then the other part about it is the pay setting. That's this component, which is the difference in wage premiums for men versus women at this firm. Okay? And if they're different, and then you might be interested, is this a firm that pays, when you go to this firm from the restaurant sector or from a job that doesn't pay any premium, and you're male, do you get like a 10% premium, and do women who take that job only get like an 8% premium, okay? And we showed, this is a paper that I did with Pat Klein and Ana Cardozo, using Portuguese data. We showed that these are important. Subsequently, people have implemented this in a bunch of other countries. So there's a nice paper using IMSS data. There's another paper, another former student of mine in Chile that's implemented this. And so there's, at the top row is the male-female wage gaps. The male-female wage gap in wages, hourly wages, is usually, around 20, 25%. Sometimes it's a little bit smaller. How much of that is due to the overall fact that women are working in firms that pay these lower premiums? So that's the overall contribution of firm wage setting effects to the story. Well, it's about 20% in Portugal, 30% in Italy, and 40% in Chile. So it's a pretty big component. It's not the whole story, but it's something. And then you can, using that decomposition, you can say, well, how much of that is because they don't get the jobs in those firms, and how much of it is because actually firms have two sets of wage policies, one for men and one for women. And it turns out most of the action is on the sorting side. Okay, there's a little bit of action on the pay gap part, but most of the action is on the sorting side. And then finally, I'm going to mention one last example. This is another example of merging administrative data sets. And this is a project I did with Fabrizio, who's here, and Raphael Olive. So everyone knows that there's one important way to find jobs is through posted vacancies. And historically, firms advertise vacancies for men and women separately. Or in the United States, they advertise it for black workers and white workers separately. And actually, until 2000, that was pretty widespread in Austria. And there was a campaign by something called the Ombud for Equal Treatment in Austria. In 2005, it was technically against the law, but people were just doing it. And the Ombud basically sent letters to all the employers and to newspapers and said, you can't do this. This is against the law. And what we show is that between 2005 and 2006, this is a fraction of advertisements, or posted vacancies, excuse me, in this vacancy system, which is the largest public vacancy posting system in Austria. And before that, 20 to 25% of jobs said that they preferred men, 20 or 25% said they preferred women, and afterwards it largely disappears. Okay? So that was good. And, when we see something like this, we say, well, we've got to do an evaluation. I mean, what can we do? And we have a paper that's got a lot of complicated parts. I'm just going to tell you the kind of the most straightforward part. So what we do is we classify firms by what kind of vacancies they were posting before the law. So some firms were largely posting male vacancies. Some firms were largely posting female vacancies, and then a bunch of firms were not posting any gender preference, okay? And they're kind of the control group. They're in the middle. And what I'm showing here is the share of female employees relative to the baseline. So this is an event study of rise in female employees or fall in female employees at these two sets of firms. So the firms that were advertising for women, their share of women goes down. Okay? Because basically, once they got rid of that thing saying women preferred, a bunch of men showed up and got jobs there. And vice versa, at the firms that were advertising for men, the share of women went up. Okay? And it's kind of remarkable. We show that it doesn't seem to have hurt the wages of these people and doesn't seem to have made the firms less productive or go out of business or anything like that. So this seems like there was just a bunch of people who were kind of putting these, the old-fashioned people in charge of recruiting, the HR department. There was a more positive view about HR departments in the previous talk, but I have to say, having worked at a couple of large companies in the United States, I have a very dim view of HR departments. So that's a very interesting example of this gatekeeping thing that's creating the sorting. Maybe it's completely just artificial, the HR department. Oh, okay, so sum up. Administrative data are now widely used. The Laboratorio was one of the first places to really push this idea broadly, make data available to graduate students. Now, basically, if you've got a graduate student in labor economics, you say, okay, find some administrative data and get a project. Okay, that's what we do. These data offer large samples, access to small populations, and the possibility of selecting very specialized comparison groups like coworkers or people with very similar trajectories beforehand. Many of these data sets have detailed characteristics. The ones that don't, for instance, IMPS doesn't have any data on education per se in the basic file, but then this new data set, I forget what it's called, has like education and occupation and union coverage and stuff. So if you can merge those two, you can really go crazy. Or we've seen examples where you take the administrative data on the wages and you merge that with the balance sheet information for the firms, and then you've got all kinds of possibilities. And these data sets have low cost. Okay, now when you approach the bureaucrats and say, "Can I have your data set?" that's the infinite cost. Okay, but the actual cost to society of these data sets is nothing. Okay? And actually, we as economists, using the data and showing people what's in there, we're providing incredible value. Because we're showing them, okay, if you do this, you can actually study or monitor what's going on. And there's a few examples of that going on now. Like, for instance, a few countries have proposed that firms have to post the share, the wages of women versus the wages of men in the country, in the firm, and so on. And I just want to end on again, bringing back the possibilities. There's so many other topics. I didn't talk about crime. I didn't talk about health. I didn't talk about immigration. I didn't talk about maternity and paternity leave. I didn't talk about collective bargaining. And all of these topics are now being studied and widely used with administrative data. And I think we really, from the European perspective and the international perspective, we really have to thank the early pioneers of this, including Bruno, who is very important in getting so many people in Torino and in Italy early on in this idea that we'll have, first of all, having evidence as part of economics. You can't imagine how controversial that probably was in 1970. Most economists were theorists. Actually, Bruno was trained as a theorist. His original papers were about bargaining theory. So to move the whole topic to be an empirical study with research designs and evidence, we don't think about it anymore, but that was a long, long step. And that is really how economics has come to be what it is now. So thanks very much, and congratulations again to Bruno.